The Pentagon has now rejected Poland's offer to supply Ukraine with MiG-29 fighter jets, okay? These are fighter jets that Ukraine desperately needs in order to ward off or fight back against Russian forces that have invaded the country. The concern is that if the United States allows for the transfer of these fighter jets, it could lead to an escalation of war between not just Russia and Ukraine, but Russia and NATO allies. Now that is what the claim is. I'm actually gonna push back against that a little bit, but before I do, let's take a look at this video that explains exactly how Poland proposed to transfer these fighter jets to Ukraine.
What Poland offered was to fly all of its MiGs from Poland here to a US air base, Ramstein, US NATO air base in Germany, and then have them flown somehow into Ukraine. The Pentagon calls that offer untenable.
So they say it's untenable, which I found curious, right? Like, put your feelings aside regarding whether or not they should get those fighter jets, right? Just put that aside. I just want to focus on the reasoning or the excuses that we're hearing from the Pentagon, because it didn't really make much sense to me. Okay, so what are they saying? Let's go to the Pentagon press secretary, John Kirby, who says this: the prospect of fighter jets at the disposal of the government of the United States of America departing from a US NATO base in Germany to fly into airspace that is contested with Russia over Ukraine raises serious concerns for the entire NATO alliance. Now, he doesn't really go into many details about what those concerns are. All you can really do is speculate that he's referring to an escalation of this war and essentially pulling the United States and NATO allies into a direct war with Russia. I think that is a legitimate argument to make in regard to establishing a no-fly zone. We've explained why that's a bad idea. We've explained how that would absolutely be a serious escalation of war. But in this case, you have to keep in mind that the United States has armed the Ukrainian forces and has given them all sorts of weaponry, including anti-tank missiles. And I'll give you the rundown of what the United States has supplied to Ukraine in just a moment. But to give you the rest of the thread from John Kirby, he says, it is simply not clear to us that there is a substantive rationale for it. We will continue to consult with Poland and our other NATO allies about the issue and the difficult logistical challenges it presents. But we do not believe Poland's proposal is a tenable one. Now, Vice President Kamala Harris is set to meet with officials in Poland about this very issue to try to find another way to get the fighter jets to Ukraine. And one of the ideas, initial ideas, was, well, maybe what we can do is we can have Ukrainian pilots go to Poland and fly the fighter jets from Poland to Ukraine. I don't know why that idea has been scrapped, but apparently that was one of the initial proposals, and I don't know where that went. But with that said, there's other issues here that I wanted to explore. For instance, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who clearly wants us to establish a no-fly zone, which isn't gonna happen, is furious with the United States because he believes that US officials have given Ukraine mixed messages on this very issue. He says this: Russia uses missiles, aircraft, helicopters against us, against civilians, against our cities, against our infrastructure. This is the world's humanitarian duty to respond, but there's no decision. So when will the decision be made? He continues to say, listen, we have a war. We do not have time for all these signals. This is not ping pong. This is about human lives. We ask once again, solve it faster. Do not shift the responsibility. Send us planes. What's become clear to me is that the United States isn't necessarily against getting fighter jets to Ukraine. And these particular fighter jets are the ones that the Ukrainian forces have experience with, they would be able to use, so that's an important part of this as well. And so Jenssaki, the White House press secretary, was asked about this, and I think the question is very clear here, but I feel that Psaki evaded the question and went off on some weird deflection. Maybe my interpretation is different from yours. I want you to take a look at the video, judge for yourselves.
Does the U.S. want the Ukraine to get jets, and how urgent a priority is that?
So let me give you an update on the status. As of now, the Secretary Austin, Chairman Milley, and members of our Defense Department are in touch with Ukrainian counterparts, NATO counterparts, discussing what are clearly logistical challenges here. And I would note, Josh, that in the statement put out by my colleague at the Pentagon yesterday, he made clear that obviously a proposal from yesterday that fighter jets manned by Americans departing a NATO base to fly into airspace contested with Russia raises serious concerns for the United States and NATO. So the logistical questions here, just to put a little fine point on it, are things like, how do you get planes into Ukraine in a way that is not escalatory?
So does the United States want to get fighter jets to Ukraine? Answer yes or no, and then explain what you mean by logistical problems. Like they're worried, they claim that they're worried about escalating the war, but we've given Ukraine all sorts of military weaponry to attack Russia. It's not like Putin doesn't know about that. And there is mixed messaging coming from the Pentagon and from the White House, to be clear. In fact, why don't we go to an earlier statement that was made by Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He was asked about possibly transferring fighter jets over to Ukraine, and he was pretty clear about where he stood on this issue.
What more can the United States do here if, for instance, the Polish government, a NATO member, wants to send fighter jets? Does that get a green light from the US, or are you afraid that that will escalate tension?
No, that gets a green light. In fact, we're talking with our Polish friends right now about what we might be able to do to backfill their needs if, in fact, they choose to provide these fighter jets to the Ukrainians. What could we do? How can we help to make sure that they get something to backfill the planes that they're handing over to the Ukrainians? We're in very active discussions with them about that.
So what's really going on? Why did the United States reject Poland's offer? And so I had to dig because nothing coming from the White House was really making much sense. I noticed this headline from Reuters. It really caught my attention. US rejects Poland's offer to give it Russian-made fighter jets for Ukraine. Listen, regardless of what you think about this war, and I think I've been pretty clear about, how it's important to support Ukrainians, especially since they made a deal with the West to give up the entirety of their nuclear arsenal with security guarantees from the United States. Okay, that deal was made between Ukraine, the United States, Russia, and the UK. And that was back in the 1990s. So I think that the lessons that could be learned by the United States abandoning Ukraine are terrible lessons. The lesson is, don't trust the United States when you give up your nuclear arsenal. They'll rip up nuclear deals that they've made with you. In the case of Iran, that was certainly the case. Something kind of similar happened in Libya, and now you have the situation in Ukraine. So I understand, aside from the morality that you might attach to it, there was a deal made, and I do think it's important to follow through on that deal and offer security to Ukraine in a way that will not escalate war. I think that's also important, which is why I don't support the no-fly zone. But remember, disaster capitalism is real. And so I read that headline and I'm like, is this because they're talking about sending over Russian-made fighter jets when maybe US defense contractors are like, no, this is an opportunity for us to exploit. What are you guys doing? That's a possibility. I don't know for sure. That's just something that I'm speculating about due to concerns I have about the disaster capitalism that's usually tied into all of these conflicts that the United States gets involved in. But there's something else that caught my attention, which I'll get to in just a second. But again, for anyone who claims that, no, the United States doesn't want to send fighter jets because we're just worried it'll really upset Russia. We have armed Ukrainians with a lot of weaponry. In less than a week, the United States and NATO have pushed more than 17,000 anti-tank weapons, including Javelin missiles, over the borders of Poland and Romania, which are NATO allies, by the way, unloading them from giant military cargo planes so they can make the trip by land to Kiev. Ukrainian soldiers armed with shoulder-fired Javelin anti-tank missiles have several times in the past week attacked a miles-long convoy of Russian armor and supply trucks, helping stall the Russian ground advance as it bears down on Kiev, Pentagon officials said. So again, we have no problem arming Ukrainians, clearly. So as I kept looking into this, digging and digging and digging, what is happening? What is the real reason why the US turned this offer down from Poland? Let's go to the last graphic here. This was buried in a New York Times article. While Biden was in Wilmington, Delaware, his National Security Council staff spent much of the day trying to find a way for Poland to transfer to Ukraine a fleet of well-used Soviet-made MiG-29 fighter jets that Ukrainian pilots know how to fly. This is the important part. But the deal is contingent on giving Poland, in return, far more capable American-made F-16s, an operation made more complicated by the fact that many of those fighters are promised to Taiwan, where the United States has greater strategic interests. Why is that buried in a New York Times article? Like, the fact that reporters are asking Jenssaki for clarity on this means that reporters don't know what's going on. That what I just read you is something that you literally have to spend hours digging for, searching for to find. See, when we're making promises for military capabilities and weaponry and fighter jets all over the world, that's relevant. That's an important part of the story. It should be front and center when covering why the US has decided to turn Poland down. But understand, US officials seem pretty open to this deal. The only thing standing in the way was that we don't have enough fighter jets to give to Taiwan and to Ukraine. But the reason why they were open to this deal to begin with is because there's a place there for US defense contractors to make a little bit of money. So who knows how this is gonna play out? Again, I don't blame Zelenskyy for being frustrated at the contradictory messages coming from the White House. You have Anthony Blinken saying we're gonna greenlight this, then you have John Kirby saying this is untenable. It's a mess, it really is. But the fact of the matter is, this situation on the ground is absolutely devastating to Ukrainian civilians. I feel awful for them. I feel awful for the people who are also suffering consequences of Putin's invasion in Russia as a result of these economic sanctions. But the only thing that's certain is that as long as this war continues, more and more innocent people are gonna die. And the contradictory messaging and the honestly questionable reporting on issues that are as important as whether or not we transfer fighter jets to Ukraine is really disappointing, for lack of a better word. I'd use other words that I can't use on the show. But that's where we're at right now. That's what's really going on with this decision to turn Poland down.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.